Hello, this is Brian Russell, and this is my chapbook, Meeting Dad, published by Accents Publishing in 2010. Meeting Dad, a memoir by Brian Russell, Chapter 1. I slammed the bright red foam-covered bat against the column in the middle of the room and yelled, the blows punctuating my words. Why wouldn't he ever write, Wump, or call, Wump? Doesn't he even fucking care? Wump, wump, wump. I screamed through tears that made the corners of my eyes itch. This was marathon, 2 full days of group therapy, and it was day 2 on a Sunday afternoon in December. In the room, Jerry, the therapist, and 8 or 9 other teenagers, some a year or two younger than me, a few a couple years older. I was 14. And I had had it with not knowing or hearing from my natural father. 2 years earlier, when John Russell officially adopted my brother Scott and me, the family court had offered Bob Jaycox an opportunity to contest the adoption, but he hadn't even bothered to reply. No, yes, no, 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 nothing. No reply, I yelled, throat scratchy. What the fuck? Why don't you just call him, Brian? A red-headed girl suggested. Ask him yourself. I said nothing. Do what you think. Do you think you might be able to do that, Brian? Jerry asked, stroking his neatly trimmed beard. I've been thinking about it for a while. Is the idea of calling him scary? Jerry probed. A little, I admitted. Call him, the chorus chanted. Do it. Well, I guess I couldn't feel more hurt or rejected than I already do, so why shouldn't I? One boy, a lump of a kid wearing baggy pants, chimed in. Why bother? He's just gonna disappoint you all over again, I bet. Jerry gently chided the boy's negativity. He scooched his folding metal chair a few inches toward me and said, Don't pressure yourself, Brian. Take your time. Just give it some thought. That night, it was all I thought about. Within a few days, I'd made the decision. Though nervous, even a little scared, I decided the first step was to talk to Mom about it. My mother had recently enrolled in the University of Buffalo to earn a BA in linguistics. This evening, she was sitting at the head of the dining room table, books spread out before her, deeply immersed in her schoolwork. But she'd made it clear to all of us that if we needed to talk, we should feel free to approach her, even while she was doing her homework. And I needed to talk. Taking a seat next to her, I was direct. Mom, do you know how to reach Bob Jaycox? Do you have a phone number or an address? For a moment, she kept her gaze on her book. Why are you asking? I guess I want to talk to him. Get some answers. Yes, I do, she said, pushing her schoolwork aside and looking up toward me, concern in her dark brown eyes. What's bringing this on? It's something we talked about a lot in Marathon, I said, about trying to find him, you know. I see, she said. As she turned her head away in thought, I noticed the light from the hanging lamp shining on her frosted hair. It shimmered. I figured you'd have gotten his number from the adoption court, I said. Shaking her head slightly, she explained, No, I didn't get his number from the court, but I do have it. Oh, some months ago, your Uncle Ben told me that he'd read in a Cornell alumni newsletter that Bob was living in San Juan, Puerto Rico, she began. Puerto Rico, I interrupted. I've never known anyone from Puerto Rico. Anyway, she continued, a few weeks later, I was in the UB library and I happened to notice rows and rows of phone books from all over the country. I don't know what made me do this, but I found the phone book for Puerto Rico, looked him up, and jotted down his number and address. I don't know why I did it, but I did. Well, I want to call him, I said. There are things I need to know. A short pause. What do you hope to learn? I bit my left thumbnail and stared at its jagged edge. What if he somehow, I don't know, rejects you, she asked. He's been rejecting me for 11 years, I shot back. I think I'm sort of used to it by now. I took a breath and lowered my voice. Mom, at least I'll know that I made an effort. At least I'll know that I tried, which is more than I can say for him. You sound angry. Of course I'm angry. But it's not as if I'm going to call him up and yell at him. I just want to ask him if he ever thinks of us. I want to ask why he's never been in touch with us. After another short silence, I asked, so can I have his number? Of course, she said. I'll go get it for you. Mom walked over to me, put her arms on my shoulders, and kissed the top of my head. Thank you, I said. She went upstairs to retrieve the number and was back within a couple minutes. After handing me the piece of paper, she asked, do you want me to tell Dad, or would you like to? You can, I sighed, if you don't mind. No, I don't mind. Thanks, Mom. She left me at the table and I began to prepare for the call. I decided to call him Collect. I figured if he didn't accept the charges, then I'd know he had no interest in speaking with me, and I'd know he truly didn't care. About an hour later, Mom and Dad ushered me into Dad's study. It was a cluttered room filled with floor-to-ceiling bookcases overflowing with books. Every surface in the room was covered in piles of books, magazines, large manila envelopes, and dozens of lined yellow pads of paper. This was Dad's inner sanctum and a place that was absolutely off limits to the kids. He told us on more than one occasion that if he caught us in his study, the belt will wail tonight. He had borrowed that line from a Bill Cosby routine, but none of us doubted that he meant it, nor did we think it was very funny when he said it. Being allowed to use the study didn't mean I could sit in Dad's desk chair. Rather, he pulled a chair into the sacred room and cleared a small section of the desk, moving the phone so I could reach it from where I sat. Scott listened in on the upstairs phone. Mom stood behind me. I held the small blue piece of paper in my hand. In my mother's instantly recognizable cursive, I read the name Bob Jaycox and his address in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, I thought, what an exotic place. Below the address in Mom's left-handed slanted script were 10 numbers. 10 digits that might end 11 years of estrangement from my father. I dialed 0. The operator answered, and in as strong a voice as I could muster, I began. Yes, I'd like to make a person-to-person collect call. What number, sir? I gave her the number. For whom are you calling? Bob Jaycox. And who shall I say is calling? Brian Weston Russell. I used my middle name because I was afraid he might not know who I was if I simply said Brian Russell. After a moment, the phone began to ring. A woman with a strong Southern accent answered. The operator droned, I have a person-to-person collect call for Bob Jaycox from Brian Weston Russell. Is Mr. Jaycox available? Silence. The lady with the accent stammered, yes, he is. Will you hang on a minute? I'll hold, the operator replied in her detached voice. A few seconds later, I heard a voice say, this is Bob Jaycox. The operator repeated her spiel, and after the briefest of pauses, he said, well, I surely will. The operator told me that we were connected. Indeed, after all this time, we now were. Brian Russell, the voice said, well, I'll be. "This is your son," I said. "Well, I surely know that. Hello, son. What a pleasant surprise." Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed my mother slip out of the room. I cannot begin to relate with any level of accuracy the balance of this conversation. I was nervous and aware of a tension in my body and a shaking in my voice I'd never experienced before. He was thrilled to hear from me. His voice exuded warmth and he spoke in a slow and slightly southern drawl. His interest in me was disarming, and I found it difficult to hold on to my anger. I could hear that he was smiling. And now, despite the years of anger and hurt, I wanted nothing more than to see that smile. As if he were reading my mind, he said, "Well, I'd sure love for you and your brother to come down and visit me, meet my wife, Janie, your sister, Dana, and your younger brother, Dirk." While it's hard to say precisely what I'd expected from this phone call, I was certainly surprised that he'd so quickly offered to fly my brother and me down to San Juan, Puerto Rico, just as soon as we could come. I told him that I'd have to talk to Mom and Dad first, but that I'd very much like to visit. He told me to feel free to call him, collect anytime, and he secured my phone number in order to be able to reject the collect call charges and instead call me back directly. As the call came to an end, I agreed that we would be in touch soon with an answer regarding his proposal that we visit. He ended the call with what I soon learned was a trademark phrase of his. "Well, good enough." And then he said, "I love you, son." I simply exhaled bye, not bye, Dad, not bye, Bob. I didn't know what to call him. Chapter 2. The temperature was in the single digits and a fierce wind blew on the afternoon of December 28, 1977, as Scott and I prepared to fly to Puerto Rico. Mom and Dad drove us to the airport, reminding us of all the precautions we had to take since we were two kids flying alone. I was nervous and excited, eager and apprehensive, and in some ways filled with fear. How would I recognize my father at the airport? How would he recognize us? I worried. I recall little about the flight from Buffalo to Miami, where we had to change planes. The Miami airport was vast, far larger than the Buffalo airport, and my brother and I had to run from one end of the terminal to the opposite end in order to catch the plane that would carry us to San Juan. I had not realized at the time that as two minors traveling alone, we could have easily had a gate crew worker drive us over on one of those carts. And so we ran. During the flight from Miami to San Juan, Scott and I made promises to each other. "Whatever happens, it'll be okay if we stick together," I assured him. "You're my brother, and we're never going to leave each other alone in any place while we're there," Scott said. We were both scared and excited. At nearly 1 a.m, the plane touched down in San Juan. Disembarking from the place, we descended onto the tarmac. The temperature must have been in the 80s at least, and the pavement seemed as if it was melting beneath our feet. There was no wind, and although we lived on an island surrounded by the Niagara River, I had never felt such humidity. It felt like we had landed in a foreign country. All around us, people spoke Spanish or switched from English to Spanish and back again with ease. The men all wore short pants and short sleeve shirts with the top several buttons unbuttoned. The women mostly wore light cotton dresses that looked as if they had been vibrantly colorful at one time, but had long since been bleached by the tropical sun. Scott and I followed the others from our plane to baggage claim. As we waited for our luggage, I looked around for any sign of Bob J. Cox. I saw a man who looked a little bit like Bob had looked in a 15-year-old photograph I'd studied of him, but the man didn't have a mustache, so it couldn't be him. Bob didn't have a mustache in that photo either, but during our last call before the trip, he had told me that he had a mustache, a receding hairline that was beginning to gray, and what some might refer to as a beer belly. He also said, "Son, don't you worry. There ain't no way I'm not gonna recognize my boys. I bet I'd know you both if I ran into you in the middle of Times Square." He wasn't at baggage claim. What had he told me? I struggled to remember. Had he said that he'd meet us at baggage claim or right outside? Why wouldn't he be at baggage claim? He knows we've never been here and that we're two kids traveling alone. I pushed my worries away and focused on searching for our luggage on the carousel. Upon securing our bags and assuring Scott that he was probably waiting for us outside, I led us toward the exit. A long hallway led to the door at the front of the terminal. The outside wall of the terminal was made of cement in a crisscross pattern that formed diamonds of open space. Through those diamonds, we could see hundreds of people waiting to meet arriving passengers. For a moment, I panicked. How will we ever find him among all the people? There were mothers, fathers, grandparents, infants, squealing babies, and little children running around as if in the middle of some great party or celebration. The sticky hot air felt heavy on my shoulders, and I had to strain not to let Scott see my fear. After what seemed like an awfully long time, but was likely only a couple minutes, I saw him. And he saw me. My father had turned 39 earlier that month, but looked older than that to me. At least he looked older than my mother. I knew him instantly, though, and the broad smile he flashed indicated that he recognized his sons as well. He was 5 feet 9 inches tall and barrel-chested. The combination of his ruddy Irish skin and a very dark tan gave him a sort of burnt umber tone. He wore a short-sleeved white cotton shirt that effectively masked the extra 10 or 20 pounds he carried around his midsection. The khaki pants and loafers with no socks completed the image that almost seemed a cliche of tropical climate garb. My father pointed towards the door outside, indicating he would meet us there. Upon exiting the terminal, we saw him standing near the curb with his arms folded across his chest. He walked towards us as we approached and gave us each a bear hug. "Well, it sure is good to see you boys, a sight for sore eyes indeed," he said as he held onto our shoulders. "I don't know how I've let it be so long. I've missed you both so very much. Come on now, let's get you home. We have plenty of time to catch up." His directness was unsettling, and just as it had on that first phone call, made it difficult for me to hang on to my anger. If I had heard kindness in his voice, now I was confronted with seeing the kindness in his eyes. They were very dark brown, just like mine, and bright, warm, and inviting. As we rode in his beat-up mustard brown Volvo to his home in San Juan, I realized that I had to address the what to call him question sooner rather than later. I noticed he had a CB radio in his car and asked him about it. "What's your handle?" "Oh, the CB? Do you boys use the CB radio?" he asked. "Yeah, we do sometimes. We've got one at home. My handle is the Fiddler," I answered. I'd been so taken by Lou Gossett Jr.'s performance in the miniseries Roots that had aired earlier that year that I'd adopted his character's name as my CB handle. "I'm King Crab," Scott volunteered from the back seat. "I'm the motivator," our father said, as if it were a state secret. Why the motivator, I asked. That's what I do. I need to motivate my salespeople every day. So I'm the motivator. After a rather lengthy pause, I cautiously began. Well, I'm not really sure what we should call you. Maybe motivator would work. Well, son, you and Scott can call me motivator, or you can call me Jay, which is what most people around here call me, or you can call me Bob, or you can always call me Dad. Scott and I spent much of that first visit calling him motivator, interspersed with the occasional Jay. Since that trip, I've always thought of and referred to him as Jay. When he pulled into his driveway, I was struck by how different the houses in Puerto Rico looked as compared to the houses where we lived. His was a one-story, smallish, ranch-style house with a carport to the side of it. In front of the house and surrounding the carport was the same sort of cement in crisscross patterns I'd seen at the airport. As he brought the car to a stop, he said, "There are lizards in the backyard that I'll show you boys tomorrow." Everyone was awake when we went inside the house despite the late hour. Jay introduced us to his Puerto Rico family. His wife, Cheney, was a petite woman with short-cropped black hair and the thinnest lips I'd ever seen. She had a shy, almost cramped smile and seemed to keep her lips pursed tightly at all times, as if she had just eaten a lemon rind. Tiny little wrinkles appeared above her lips, so, well, no doubt from the constant pressure of maintaining her pursed expression. When she smoked a cigarette, which was nearly all the time, as best I could tell, she held it between the third and fourth fingers of her left hand and inhaled almost violently before exhaling languidly, forcing the smoke in a downward diagonal contrail toward the floor. Dana, Cheney's daughter from a previous marriage, was 12. She didn't look very much like her mother and stood an inch or two taller, perhaps 5'4" to Cheney's 5'2". Dana wore her mahogany hair just past her shoulders and was already developing into a woman with Barbie-like curves. She was quick with a smile and seemed to have a confidence in herself that I didn't quite understand, for I had no such confidence myself. Dirk was Jay and Janie's son, and he looked like them both. He must have been 8 or so that December, but he was already as tall as his mother, and it was clear that he'd inherited Jay's stocky frame. Dirk was in near constant movement, jumping up onto a sofa or chair and then jumping off again to run and retrieve something from the other room, a ball or a baseball mitt or whatever it might be that caught his eye. Janie was forever telling him to just sit still, but Dirk would have none of it. Dana and Dirk were both excited to meet their 2 new older brothers. For my part, I found it hard to think of them as siblings, at least right away. They were, rather, children who were with the father who had left me. They were living with my father. They had what I had been longing for all these years. After visiting for maybe 45 minutes, Cheney announced it was time for bed, saying, "Now give me some sugar." Jay immediately interjected, "Now, kids, you heard your mother. It's time to give her and me some sugar and get on into bed." I did not know what this sugar thing was all about, but quickly learned that it meant a kiss on the cheek. Both kids kissed their mom and dad and headed off to their bedrooms. It's difficult to describe what it felt like to see those 2 kids kissing Jay and Janie. Scott and I never kissed mom and dad goodnight. I wondered, if Jay had never gone away, would we have grown up kissing our parents goodnight? How could a man who embraced this nightly display of affection be the same man who left us and remained in the shadows for 11 long years? How could this be the same man who, without so much as a phone call or letter explaining himself, silently agreed to John Russell's adopting Scott and me? But that first night in Puerto Rico, seeing Bob Jaycox for the first time in 11 years was not the time to ask why. I was exhausted, physically and emotionally. It was time for bed, for all of us. Janie said goodnight to Scott and me, and Jay helped us open the sofa bed in the living room. This was where Scott and I would sleep. That first night, I had an accident. I wet the bed. Something that, while a problem for me as a younger child, I had not done in at least 5 or 6 years. The warm liquid awakened Scott. Shame filled me, and I began to cry. I was 14 years old, for Christ's sake, sleeping for the first night in Jay's house, and I wet the fucking bed. I thought Jay would be ashamed of his firstborn son, and I knew that Scott would be furious with me. But Scott wasn't mad. He simply said that things happen and that we should wash the seats. As quietly as we possibly could, Scott and I stripped the sheets off the bed, tiptoed down the hallway to the washer and dryer we'd seen earlier when Jay was giving us a tour of the estate, and we stuffed the sheets into the washing machine. A few minutes after we turned the machine on, Jay appeared. "What's up?" he asked. I had an accident," I stammered. "I wet the bed. I feared the worst. He'd hit me. He'd yell at me. He'd belittle me for wetting the bed at 14. He'd tell me that this whole visit was dumb and that he was going to put us on a plane back home the next day." Tears welled in my eyes, which only deepened my shame. Crybaby, I thought to myself. Jay looked at us both. He shook his head with a smile and said, "Well, it seems at least your mother has taught you both how to use the washing machine. And I appreciate you taking the responsibility to clean it up. Why don't you all come on into the kitchen and I'll make you some of my famous strawberry shortcake." I couldn't believe it. I had expected to be yelled at, criticized, ridiculed, maybe even beaten. Where was his shame in me? Where was his disappointment? I felt as if I were on location at some exotic film set and nothing was going according to script. I'd done something that I was certain would make Jay ashamed of me, and his response was to make us strawberry shortcake at 3 a.m. In later years, the way Jay handled that incident came to symbolize for me how he demonstrated his love for his 2 boys. He accepted us for who we were, no matter what we did. The rest of that first visit to Puerto Rico is something of a blur. Jay took us to his office and introduced us to all his colleagues. He seemed to beam with pride at calling Scott and me my sons. At times this annoyed me, and the anger rushed back with me thinking, what right do you have to introduce us as your sons? You haven't been there for us. Hell, you don't even know us. But then Jay would put his bare paw of a hand on my shoulder, and my self-righteous indignation would evaporate as rapidly into the tropical air as San Juan's daily morning rain did. Just as the air remained heavy with humidity once the water was off the ground, I remained heavy with my inability to forgive quite yet. Jay had arranged to take all but one day of that week off from work. So on that first day, when he had to work, we simply went with him. After the office, it was off to do his rounds, visiting 7-Elevens, several restaurants, and nameless stores and plazas with Spanish names from one side of San Juan to the other. Any place that sold icy frozen drinks. Watching Jay interact with all these people was extraordinary. He knew everybody. He asked about their wives and children by name. He moved about these stores as if he was royalty of some sort, and each store manager treated him with great deference and humor. He introduced us to everyone, displaying the same pride he'd beamed in the office. "Meet my 2 boys," he'd say. This is Brian. He's quite the piano player, you know. And this is Scott, a very gifted swimmer. Scott and I stared at our shoes, embarrassed, as he bragged on his newfound sons. After that first day, Jay tried to show us as much of San Juan and the Puerto Rico experience as he could. He took us to El Morro, an impossibly large fort that towers above San Juan Bay. It's the largest fort in the Caribbean and has served as San Juan's protector for more than 4 centuries. He took us to the Condado, which at night was San Juan's red light district. There at the Condado Plaza Hotel, we sat by the side of the sea, drinking pina coladas made with Barrilito 5-star rum. You haven't had a pina colada until you've had one in the Caribbean with fresh pineapple and coconut milk. He took us to Old San Juan, along cobblestone streets lined with pastel-colored, tile-roofed houses that were classic examples of Spanish colonial architecture. This area of town reminded me of photographs I'd seen of Greece or of the French Riviera. It seemed as if we'd been transported to the Mediterranean Sea. In one of the many craft stores that dotted Old San Juan, Scott and I bought a hand-carved onyx turtle for Dad, a wooden wall hanging of a bearded man in profile for Grandpa, and a brightly colored scarf for Mom. We also brought Mom a bottle of Barrilito 5-star rum. He took us up into El Yunque rainforest on a road that curved up and out of San Juan. Along the road were hundreds of ramshackle wooden shacks covered by rusty roofs and corrugated tin. Every now and again, we'd come upon small storefronts, El Kiosco with Coca-Cola signs plastered all over the place, and Taller de Mecanica, which translates literally to workshop of mechanics. I thought of Buffalo and the steel mills that had closed and the miles and miles of now empty factories. On New Year's Eve, a few nights before we were to fly back to Buffalo, Jay threw an enormous party in his backyard, inviting all his friends to meet his sons. He had a friend bring an electronic keyboard that was set up in the backyard for me to play. His guitar came out, and before I knew it, Jay and I were making music together. Janie and Dana brought stacks of sheet music out and piled them next to the keyboard for me. Show tunes, pop songs, jazz standards, country music. We played a little bit of everything. Playing all those familiar songs made me feel at home, less nervous about all the strangers at the party, less anxiety-ridden over my conflicted feelings about Jay. As a reward for my playing, I got to have a couple of pina coladas that night, too. The night before we left Puerto Rico, Jay offered to fly Scott and me down again in the summer, saying he wanted us to visit for as many weeks as he could. We both wanted to return and eventually determined that the summer trip would last 3 weeks. I think the reason I don't remember much about our trip home is that I was already anticipating the summer visit. I wanted to get to know Jay more. I wanted to get to know Janie, Dana, and Dirk more. I'd come to discover that Janie wasn't as unhappy and uptight as her visage initially suggested. When she smiled, it was with her eyes. She was a private person and reserved, but I'd learned that she did have a sense of humor, arid though it might have been. Dana was endlessly curious about Scott and me. She wanted to know everything about our lives on Grand Island, about our mother, about Big Gull Lake in Ontario, where we spent several weeks each summer. She wanted to know about our brothers and sisters, how we liked school, and what sort of friends we had back home. Dana was guileless and instantly embraced us as the big brothers she never knew she had. Dirk took to Scott. They were both athletic and had a similar mischievousness at their core. I think I was so focused on getting to know Jay that I barely got to know Dirk. He was a gadfly flitting about aimlessly and complaining bitterly whenever not allowed to join Jay, Scott, and me on any excursion. Who could blame him? He just wanted to be included. He was too young to understand that Jay needed some time to try to get to know his other two sons. At the airport, Jay accompanied us to the desk where we checked our bags and got our boarding passes before walking us to the gate. I remember him hugging us both, Scott first, then me. While he held me tightly, he whispered, "I love you, son, and I can't wait to see you the next time." With that, the embrace was over. He took a couple steps back, praising his two boys and saying, "Well, good enough." Then he was gone. He had whispered to me, "I love you, son, and I can't wait to see you the next time." I was filled with contradictory emotions. On the one hand, I had just heard what I'd yearned to hear for so many years. On the other hand, I was thinking, so that's it? You can simply tell me you love me and you can't wait to see me the next time, and that's supposed to make up for 11 years of no contact, 11 years of absence, silence, neglect. I was angry. I was hurt. And I was eagerly anticipating our return trip to Puerto Rico. Chapter 3. In July of 2006, my wife Gloria and I were attending the closing performance of my production of Lee Blessing's play, The Winning Streak, which had opened on June 25th, 2006, the first anniversary of our wedding. Entering the theater and taking our seats, we heard the usual buzz of voices one hears before the lights dim and the performance begins. Seated right in front of us were two women, both well past middle age. It was hard to determine their relationship. Perhaps they were sisters, perhaps close friends. It's even possible they were mother and daughter, as one was quite a bit older than the other. The younger of the two was reading my director's notes aloud to the older woman. This is what we heard. Family tells us much about who we are, where we come from, and sometimes provides us clues as to where we might be heading, or at least where we might wish to try to steer our course. In the absence of family, some feel unmoored, untethered, unsure. Not all children grow up with violence, abuse, or neglect, but far too many do. My own natural father left the house before I was 3 years old. I never heard from him again. At 14, I tracked him down in Puerto Rico, where he was living with his second wife and new family. Over the years, I saw him from time to time. I learned some important things about where I come from, who his parents and grandparents were and the like, but I never, ever called him Dad. I refused. I guess in a way, he was a disappointment to me. He wasn't as successful as I'd maybe wished he would be. And it was certainly very difficult for me to understand how he could just walk away from his two sons the way he did. But that disappointment was from the oh so very simple viewpoint of a child. On May 18, 2005, my natural father died. I hadn't seen him since August of 1998, although I had invited him to my June wedding and was very hopeful that he would attend. I was excited to see him again. I never did, of course. And how disappointed I am that I was ever disappointed in him and that I never called him Dad. This production is dedicated to him, to Bob J. Jacobs, my natural father. I miss you a lot. There is something surreal about hearing your own words coming out of a stranger's mouth. And hearing them nearly 2 months after I had written them provided me with fresh ears, with perspective. Listening to those words being read aloud, I heard something I'd never heard before. Jay's voice in my words. A similar cadence, perhaps, a turn of phrase, the use of repetition. Reading and rereading Jay's letters, I'm struck by the honesty and clarity of his writing. He rails against a world that places less value than it once did on leisure time, reading and art and music. And as I read those words, I recognize my own concerns about the coarsening of our culture. He attacks the legal fiction of the corporation, observing that they have never breathed a breath of air, never watched a sunset, never held a child. Reading those words, I recognize my own political leanings. Remembering Jay and our relationship, sporadic though it was, my anger and disappointment diminish. Yes, he was an imperfect father. I was an imperfect son. I can recall a phone call with Jay sometime between the two Puerto Rico visits. I asked him why he hadn't been in touch all those years. I asked him if he never thought of us at all. To his credit, he didn't tell me that my mother had asked him to stop calling. Rather, he explained that his own birth mother had made herself something of a pest after his parents divorced when he was a child. He didn't want to do that. He knew and admired John Russell, and he thought it best to steer clear and allow our new family to develop free of his interference. One day, a couple years after that first visit to Puerto Rico, I was talking to Jay on the phone, and I self-righteously sneered, "You know, I will never call you Dad." And he said, "Well, Brian, that's your prerogative. But know this, I will always call you son." Meeting Dad. Accents Publishing.